Hello and welcome to How to Win, the Vandenberg Coalition's series on the challenges facing the United States military and the Department of Defense in an era of great power competition, heightened tensions, and increasing chaos around the world. Today, we're discussing rebuilding America's atrophied defense industrial base. Here to discuss with me is Dr. Seth Jones. Seth Jones is Senior Vice President, Harold Brown Chair, Director of the International Security Program, and Director of the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Prior to joining CSIS, he was the Director of International Security and Defense Policy at the RAND Corporation. He was also the Plans Officer and Advisor to the Commanding General of U.S. Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan. Thank you for watching. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be on. Thank you for having me.
Well, help us level set. What is the defense industrial base and what does it mean for U.S. national security?
Well, the defense industrial base is really the broader ecosystem of not just the government, and it's not just the Department of Defense, but state, the Department of Commerce, and then the broader set of industry. Not just the primes, the Lockheed Martins or the RTXs or Boeings, but also a supply base of over 100,000 companies that produce various elements of hardware, so think airplanes, to software, so artificial intelligence that may be pushing our air defense systems to shoot down incoming missiles. So massive, and without the industrial base, you get nothing. You don't have anything. You don't have software, you don't have hardware. It builds the systems that our country uses to defend itself.
So when you're sort of thinking about the current footing of the U.S. defense industrial base, especially given, increasing tensions around the world, what would you say that sort of looks like?
Well, I think that the challenge historically is that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. went into this shedding its industrial base to some degree, a consolidation of what was called the Last Supper, where the Defense Department essentially tells private industry to consolidate. Defense budgets went down pretty dramatically. They came back up a little bit during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, more on supplemental and OCO funding. But the challenge right now is that the U.S. defense industrial base is still largely on a peacetime footing. Well, what does that mean? It's the system is not producing weapon systems for a protracted war against a major adversary like China or Russia, and what it means also the bureaucracy involved in it, the contracting system it's ancient. It takes a long time for the contracting process to work it out. If the U.S. wants to provide important technical capabilities to some of its key allies and partners, like the British or Australians, AUKUS partners, it does it through an ITAR system that is glacial sometimes in how it moves. So overall, it is a defense industrial base that is operating on a peacetime footing when we have a war in the Middle East, a war in Europe with the Russians, and we are close in Asia. So bad timing.
Well, speaking of Asia, how does our peacetime footing compare to China's footing?
I would say that about a year or two ago, China kicked into what I call wartime industrial base footing. That doesn't mean that China is prepared to conduct a war this year or next year, but what it means is that it is building its key weapon systems, Army, Air Force, ground-based systems, space, nuclear capabilities with an extraordinary sense of urgency and specifically to fight not just anyone but the United States. So whether it's hypersonics or nuclear weapons or naval vessels, and actually large numbers of naval vessels. The capacity of the Chinese right now is 230 times larger than the United States. They are preparing for war. The United States is not right now. So they do have some advantages. They have some disadvantages, but they have some advantages in how serious they're taking this industrial base right now.
Well, this hasn't been the first time historically that the United States has been on, peacetime footing when we maybe needed to be on a more wartime footing. And you looked historically about the roles of previous administrations and the way they've really executed on those strategic visions, thinking in particular, President Eisenhower, President Roosevelt, President Reagan, President Truman, they all offer examples of the ability to really ensure our defense industrial base is operating on the level that it should be. So what are some examples from those previous administrations that a future administration should maybe consider?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that people recognize that there have been a number of administrations, frankly, both Democratic and Republican, that have revitalized the U.S. defense industrial base. They've generally done it in two types of scenarios. One is actual wartime or near wartime. So one thinks of the Roosevelt administration. Even well before Pearl Harbor in the late 1930s, there was an effort to, in the words of Roosevelt, rebuild the arsenal of democracy. And the focus there was companies like General Motors and Chrysler and eventually Ford and other companies to get them to start to build the aircraft, tanks, and other equipment that the U.S. might need down the line, but immediately that the U.S. was going to provide to the British allies that were fighting for their lives as part of a Lend-Lease program. And so in that case, there's wartime or near wartime. Truman, wartime, that was Korea, Eisenhower, and then actually during the Vietnam War, the U.S. revitalized part of its industrial base, wartime situation. But then you get the peacetime situations where you get a serious potential for conflict and you have a major adversary. That's Reagan buildup. Not just the Strategic Defense Initiative, but a heavy focus on competing with the Soviets in key conventional areas. So one thing that has been critical, or two things that have been critical in past periods are and they're very similar, they build off each other, is they generally have had to come from the White House. You cannot revitalize the defense industrial base, particularly at the level of a Department of Defense, for several reasons. One is the weapon systems today are so complicated. Technology transfers bring in other departments. So you've got Commerce and State. You've got the Hill that does appropriations, for example, or the Armed Services Committees. So there really needs to be a White House push for this, and that's what really happened. And the money that then gets pushed really needs White House level push. The second is that goes along with that. In all of the cases that I'm aware of, there was a body that initially reported to the President of the United States to revitalize the defense industrial base. Late 1930s, it was the National Defense Advisory Committee, or NDAC, that Bill Knudsen stepped down from General Motors as president, was on. It was a 7-member advisory committee. It became the War Production Board. But the whole idea of a committee like this to work for the president is that there's a sense of urgency at the direction of the president, and then it really starts to hammer away at the bureaucracy that slows things down. Other departments, the services, the military can be really slow sometimes, and it really starts to cut through that and starts to transition other elements of society to focus on revitalizing. We do not have that at this point. So we don't have either one. We don't really have White House level support for revitalization at this point, and we don't really have, we certainly don't have a body along those lines. Those would be two things I would urge any new administration to take a look at.
Right. And, I'd love to touch on an element that you sort of mentioned, which is the role of Congress and the administration when working together in terms of determining defense budget. There's going to be a need for significant investment in order to ensure that our defense industrial base is adequately supported in a lot of ways. But how do we go about considering where to make investments while still balancing other priorities?
It's a difficult issue. If you look overall at the U.S. defense budget right now as a percentage of gross domestic product rather than as a lump sum, which I think really tells you where it's at. It's between 3% and 4% right now, which is historically low in the kind of competitive environment the U.S. is in the early 1950s. During the Korean War, it was up about 14% of GDP. At various stages of the Cold War, including under Democratic presidents like Kennedy, it was somewhere around 9% of GDP. Even during the Reagan buildup, 6%. So you're in the 3% of GDP, and you've got a major Chinese war production effort right now, and you've got with the Russians too, their defense industrial bases on a wartime footing. Then you've got a relatively low defense budget. So that's the first challenge: is you're not working with a lot right now, and historically. The second is the trade-off right now between being prepared for deterrence, and if deterrence fails, a fight, and then building systems that won't surface for about a decade or so. And I would just say right now, the U.S., in my view, really needs to be prepared to fight a protracted fight within the next 2 to 3 years, if not earlier, and to get the systems it's needed to do that. And the reason is because, in my view, that's what deters conflict, is having the capabilities that if deterrence fails, that you have those kinds of capabilities. And we can talk about war games in a moment, but they're pretty bleak on what the U.S. runs out of fast in a war.
Right. And in thinking in particular about the conflict going on in Ukraine, in a lot of ways, it's been a great awakening when it comes to what production lines we need to be investing in particular with the javelins and the Stingers and the 155 millimeter munitions. But a lot of challenges remain. And, so what would be some of the challenges with defense productions that we still are facing, and which systems production lines are cause for the greatest concern? Yeah,
so the 155 millimeter munitions and systems are a great example of the defense industrial base surging. That was, to be clear, that was to a great extent the result of the acquisitions folks within the Pentagon, Bill LaPlante, Doug Bush from the U.S. Army side that really pushed along. He's probably Secretary of the Army as well. But the areas where the U.S. really is taking enormous risk on are long-range precision strike. So one of the challenges in a contingency in the Indo-Pacific is if the Chinese were to invade, for example, they would have to bring PLA forces by either ship or air. So you need long-range anti-ship missiles, or LRASMs. You need other types of long-range missiles. In our war games, we run out of those long-range precision-guided munitions in some of these, like LRASMs, in a week of a conflict. And that's a huge problem, because how do you deter if you don't have the stockpiles of some critical capabilities now? So that's one kind. There are also some things that would be helpful to ramp up on. Subs end up being critical. We are behind the curve on our shipbuilding capacity right now, and broader issues with the workforce and supply chain in our submarines. That's an area that I think we've got to solve quickly. We do have some allies and partners that have pretty big shipbuilding capabilities, but that's another big one where I'm definitely concerned.
Sure. So, diving a little bit more deeply into that, where should the next administration focus its efforts to relieve the pressure and grow the U.S. Navy's fleet to better deter in terms of those challenges you just mentioned? Yeah.
So I think what's important to begin to answer that question is to look at this from a net assessment perspective. When you look at the Chinese capabilities, not just naval, but other things they can bring to bear, they have a massive naval fleet. So they have much bigger scale and scope than the United States. One of China's largest shipyards has more capacity than all U.S. shipyards combined.
Wow.
Not just over about 230 times the capacity anyway. So part of the challenge, I think, and there have been some efforts under the Maritime Statecraft Initiative to get our shipyards going, but there's some. I would focus in part on the maritime base on providing assistance at the high school and the college level to folks that can be trained to be key parts of our naval industrial base, like sort of basic welders. And welders on the nuclear side, for nuclear substitute nuclear welders. Welders are in short supply. There's been significant problems both in recruitment and attrition in welder categories. So that's part of it as well. And probably infusing a lot more money into key systems. Again, I'm thinking, submarines, which end up being critical, and then autonomous systems for the Navy. They could be air, they could be surface, or they could be subsurface. Those are a couple of areas where I would start putting a lot of resources. There is some capacity at shipyards to go to, from, in some cases, 2 to 3 rotations during the day. So there is some slack in the system, but it's going to require a lot of effort along those lines.
And, I want to turn a little bit later to the problems when it comes to the workforce. But going back to what you said about weapon stockpiles and their importance, especially when you're on a wartime footing, there's a need to sort of balance production and consumption of munitions in particular. So could you talk about the role that our stockpiles play in deterrence in particular?
Yeah, so having a lot of weapons is critical, I think, one of the things that comes out of the war in Ukraine is it should dispel what were probably illusory notions before that war itself can be short. It's one thing if you go back to the Desert Storm. That war lasted weeks. The U.S. overran quickly, first with the air campaign. It had stealth technology, so some significant advantages. And then it's really the introduction of paveway 1s, 2s, and 3s, laser-guided bombs, overwhelmed the Iraqis. But when you look at the Russians and the Chinese, that's probably not the way it's going to work, is a quick and easy defeat of a conventional military, especially in an area like the Baltics, or the Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea that are in the backyards of the Russians or the Chinese. So I think when you talk about both stockpiles and consumption, I think what really becomes important is that you have enough to fight a protracted war, not one that goes a few weeks. That's a problem with the war plans that the U.S. has, the O plans. They're generally short in duration. They're classified, so they're not public, but most of them are short in duration. And the challenge that we see, we're in year 3 of the war in Ukraine right now. And so you need lots of munitions, of stockpiles, because when it comes to artillery, when it comes to cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, you just run out of a lot because they're expended quickly. That's what the U.S. lacks. And if you have those stockpiles, then I think it also strengthens deterrence, because the other side sees that you can fight a protracted war, so it raises the cost of doing it. That's one thing I think that I take from the so-called first and second offsets during the Cold War, is the Soviets recognized that in some key areas, the U.S. had sufficient stockpiles for a protracted war, even of precision-guided munitions, that it helped strengthen deterrence in Europe, in the Central Front.
Well, and one of the important things when it comes to ensuring those production lines are moving, our stockpiles are where they should be, is, ensuring that we have secure supply chains, which isn't necessarily the case. So especially when we're seeing businesses and subcomponent, some contractors moving to regions that are potentially not as secure as we'd like them to be, how should we actually be incentivizing them to stay?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things. One is, it is worth noting, and this was during the debate even about Ukraine, is the aid that was provided to the Ukrainians was coming, in general, from U.S. factories and U.S. workers that were manufacturing that. So I think it is important to set the record straight that the aid provided was coming from U.S. companies and U.S. workers that were building it. But I think the issue is, as I see it, is part of this is contractual, part of this is a money issue. One of the challenges with the supply chain and some of the contractors involved, so if you got a big weapon system that a Lockheed or a Northrop Grumman or an RTX or a Boeing is building, There's a huge supply chain and smaller companies that are providing different parts. It could be energetics for that. It could be gyroscopes or other things that go in. It could be chips that may be used. The issue is for a lot of systems, let's say munitions, there have been annual contracts, not multi-years. So the way the services, the Air Force, the Army, the Marine Corps, the Navy, what they will often do with munitions is decide in the early stages of a budget year that they want to be built X number of munition. But by the end of the year, they decide to move that money into other projects. So it's what you call a bill payer. So for a defense company, it can't necessarily, on a single year contract, it cannot rely on that money actually getting to it because money gets fungible by the end of a year. A multi-year contract, on the other hand, generally ensures that that defense company will get that funding for that munition, and which also means that the suppliers will also get funding. So one issue that I have been pushing, many in the department have been very receptive, is more multi-year contracts for things like munitions. And part of that is to help with a supply chain. There are other areas that are going to be a little more difficult. China controls some key supplies, including raw material. The Russians do with others, including titanium. So the U.S. really needs to think about stockpiling some raw materials and types of materials that it might lose or conflict to erupt, and really, whether it's domestically in the United States, to be finding other sources, including mines for raw materials, so you don't have to rely on a Chinese mine, including a Chinese-owned mine in Africa. Those are very serious national security concerns.
Well, and I would assume multi-year contracts that would be beneficial in terms of the type of skilled labor that these different companies are needing to, sign contracts with. So I know we touched on it earlier, but what are some examples of reskilling workers that the DoD should be considering in terms of having the people that we actually support a defense industrial base?
Yeah. So, again, with some basic components of the workforce, there is competition. Think, for example, some of the more high-tech weapon systems or systems, platforms like an F-35 or a B-21 bomber. There is competition with some of your engineers for the commercial sector or for IT companies because your engineers, even in those cases, are producing complex systems. So that gets to be a pay issue in part. With your welders, interestingly, the competition there has been, in some of the shipyards, has been less welding and more higher paying jobs, but at your local Walmart, for example. So I think there really has to be some rethinking about payments and the payment structure and benefits provided to what is a key national security industry. There's also another question which gets politically divisive very quickly in an era where, understandably, the U.S. wants to build more capabilities at home, is the U.S. does have some allies and partners that have shipbuilding capabilities. The British, or in Asia, it's got the Japanese and the South Koreans. To what degree do you want to leverage the capabilities in some areas of allies and partners to do this as well? Now, that is not to give a short end of the stick to the American worker. It is to supplement fast in particularly in a competitive environment with the Chinese. So some serious questions.
Right. And, I think these are all challenges that the future administration is really going to have to think seriously about. So in terms of one final question, we have the tools necessary to invest in our defense industrial base, and we have a playbook from prior administrations. What else does a future administration need at their disposal to take on this challenge?
I think one of the most important things is the overarching strategic vision. And I mean, at the end of the day, this is basic strategy for me. It's the way that someone like Ronald Reagan comes in in 1980 into the office of the president, recognizing that there is a serious competition with the Soviet Union. And it's a competition that, in his words, we win and they lose. And there is only one way to do that, and that is to build the capacity, and in this case, the defense industrial capacity, that you deter, and if deterrence fails, you defeat adversaries that are on a wartime footing. But you have to make that case to the American population. You have to make that case and tell them what is at stake involved. And what you have is a series of relationships, coalition formed between Beijing and Moscow and Tehran and Pyongyang. These are countries that are, at their core, they're not democratic. They do not support freedom of religion, freedom of the press, a free, open trading system. That's not the future that we want in the United States. It's not the future we want in the world. And if you want to change course, 18 straight years of decline in democracies, then you start at home with the American worker. But you have to provide the strategic vision of what is at stake right now. And the U.S., it's a serious competition, particularly coming from China right now. I have not heard anyone make that case. It needs to be made. It was made by Roosevelt in the 1930s. It was made by Reagan in the 1980s. It can be made again in the 2020s.
Well, it sounds like they knew how to win, and I'm looking forward to us doing that in the future. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.